Hello, this is Suraj Sharma, and welcome to the new video on Indian economic problems. And we are dealing with nature and structure of Indian economy. And today's topic is sectoral development of Indian economy. You can email me or you can text me on these given email ID and mobile number of mine. So, in last class, what we did is ex- we explained the concept of economic growth, and we saw the difference between economic growth and economic development, and we saw the sectoral composition of Indian economy, dividing Indian economy into three different sectors: primary, secondary, and tertiary. In this class, we'll see the interrelationship between growth and composition of Indian economy, and how these growing sectors of Indian economy are helping to grow and their role in growth process. So this is the composition of Indian economy, which we have earlier seen in the previous video, that the economy is divided into primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. Uh, Now, economic growth and structural change. The how with economic growth, the indicators of development changes, and we can divide this into five different economic parameters, and we see one by one. The first one is constituents of GDP. With the structural change, there is change in savings and the growth rate of savings. So change means there would be positive change. The savings will be increasing, the growth rate of saving will be increasing. G for government expenditure. Government expenditure will increase with the increase in revenue. The next thing is food consumption, or the proportion of food consumption will decrease with the increase in income or with economic growth. And the share of secondary and tertiary sector in total output will increase, while the share of primary sector will decrease with economic growth. So these structural changes would take place when we talk about the constituents of GDP. The second thing is employment, and employment elasticity of the sector tells you how the employment scenario would be in a particular economy. If we see that uh, agriculture absorb more and more labor, while the industry can absorb with a lesser degree of agriculture, and the service sector is the least in that parameter. So based on the employment elasticity of the sector and the changes, the structural changes, the employment scenario will be changing. The third thing is composition of exports. With economic growth, the export GDP ratio and the trade GDP ratio can increase. If the economy is opening its borders for imports and exports, and diversifying its exports, then the earnings will eventually increase and economic growth would take place. So with economic growth, the composition of exports will change, and if the economy is changing or diversifying its exports, there would be economic growth. The fourth thing is rate of increase in population, and if we see that eventually, when we talk about economic growth in the first stages, the population growth rate will eventually increase with the increase in income. But after income increases to a threshold level, then ultimately the population or the rate of increase in population will decrease. The fifth thing is distribution of income. And as we know that Simon Kuznets has also proposed this theorem, that with the advent or with the starting phase of economic growth, distribution of income becomes more unequal, and with the advanced stages of economic growth, this trend would be reversed. So these structural changes would take place with economic growth. Now we'll see how Indian economy is showing its parameters. So savings and capital formation, first we see as a percentage of GDP at current market price. So in 1951, as you see, the gross domestic savings was at 9.8% of GDP, and gross capital formation was 11%. As you see that capital formation is very important for production. As we have seen earlier, the product in production function, that capital amount of capital employed is one of the factor, and gross capital formation would be inducing investment. So this is very important. And if savings are very low, then capital formation would also be very low. So in 1951, we were dealing with low rates of savings and low rates of capital formation. And if you see gradually in 2011-12, gross domestic savings become 34.6% of the GDP, and gross capital formation goes beyond that with 39.6%. And this gross capital formation is very important for investment, and with this investment the economic growth would take place. So high savings would be inducing more investment. Openness of Indian economy, as we see that trade GDP ratio has increased gradually from 1980s, and from 1990s it increases very rapidly, and after 2003-4 the openness was very high. However, from 2011-12 it decreased to somewhat extent. As we talk about export GDP ratio is somewhat very stable, but after 2000 it increases sharply and become stable in 2005-6 to 2018. So Indian economy is not that much open compared to the more advanced economies. Growth rate of population, as this has been earlier said, that in the first stages of economic growth, the population will grow, the growth rate of population would be increasing, and eventually it would be decreasing. So after 1991 we see a sharp decline in population growth rate, and it becomes just above the 1% level of annual growth rate. Structural changes in Indian economy. As we see that how these structural changes took place in Indian economy, and we start with the first 5-year plan adopted in 1951, which focused on overall stability and building capacity production, and this very much emphasized on agricultural sector. The second 5-year plan, which was well formulated strategy, and it was based on industrialization, where we put so much money in developing core industrial sectors like iron, steel, and till 1980s the focus was on building production capacity only, and because of that the average growth rate was eventually uh, between 3 to 3.5%. After 1980s focus shifted to rapid growth, which was clearly seen in 1990s, and we adopted liberalization, privatization, globalization model in 1990s. And because of this model, with privatization, with globalization, and opening our economy to the world economy, the growth rate increased to 5.5% averagely during 1975 to 1990. It was further increased to 6.5% during 1990 to 2005, and further accelerated to about 7% during 2005-12. And uh, the very important thing here to mention is that service sector became the growth driver here, because service sector was the sector which was fastest growing sector after 1990s. And the structural change in Indian economy is very different from the Western economies. As we see, most of the Western economies shifted from primary sector to secondary and then to tertiary, but Indian economy somehow managed from primary and shifting to tertiary sector. So here the secondary sector was not given that proper attention, or we can see that it was ignored, and the secondary sector didn't grow too much. after 1990s. Now, the interrelationship of growth with the structural change can be seen in the seminal work of Arthur Lewis, where Arthur Lewis proposed the theory of unlimited supplies of labor, with Simon Kuznets, with W. Rostow, who put the different stages of economic growth, and others. What this is structural change and the growth interrelationship is telling you that with when the economy is in underdeveloped stage, it is actually agricultural based economy, and most of the labor force is absorbed in agriculture sector, and the secondary and tertiary sector is very small. But with the developing stage, or with the more advanced stage of development, the labor force shifts from the low productivity agricultural sector to higher productivity industry and service sector. Why we are saying that agriculture sector is low productive, and industry and service sectors are higher productive? Because in uh, agriculture sector, more labor is absorbed, and because of that, output per worker declines. But in industry and service sector, the productivity is very high. So these sectors uh, are much more productive than the agriculture sector. The second thing is, with the development process, this agriculture sector becomes uh, uh, there is a commercialization of this agriculture sector. So the migration of labor force, or the shift of labor force from low productive agriculture sector to high productivity industry and service sector, is telling you how the growth and structural change are interrelated to each other. The next thing is high employment elasticity of industry and agriculture. As I have already mentioned you that agriculture can absorb much more labor force than industry and service. Uh, the second in the position is industry, where particularly construction and manufacturing sector can produce uh, much more employment. Relative significance of the sector changes with growth and development. In the earlier stages, the economy is based on agriculture. In the developing phases, the development of industrial sector is there, and ultimately the economy is based on knowledge and the information technology, and it eventually the share of services increases very rapidly in total output. So this is the uh, relative significance of sector changes. Then the next thing is location of the economic activity, as can be seen in agglomerations like Delhi NCR, like Mumbai, like Hyderabad. So the location of economic activity becomes very important, and urban centers become the production hub. Here it is very important to mention that because of these location of the economic activity concentration, the inequality among different geographical places uh, can be visible, and this growth prospect actually increase the inequality. So there should be some process to decrease these uh, intergeographical differences, as Simon Kuznets itself tell on structural change that it can retard growth if its pace is too low. It here refers to structural change or its direction inefficient, but it can contribute to growth if it improves the allocation of resources. So the allocation of resources should not be concentrated to only some geographical areas. So uh, this should we should keep in mind. Now, the growth rates of real GVA, or gross value added by industry of origin, as we can see that agriculture all along is the growth rate of agriculture and allied and mining and quarrying sector is very low, and sometimes it is negative also. But if we see that manufacturing, electricity, gas, water supply, construction, or we said that the secondary sector, it grew very rapidly in the second decade of the planning. And in 1980s also, the growth rates were very high for secondary sector. But after that, there is a slump, and uh, negative growth rates are there for industry, which we are talking about, that not much care was given or importance was given to industry, and because of this it happens. And the advanced estimates of 2019-20 also sharing the same thing, as the sector is growing at 2.6% only, like agriculture and light sector. But the shining part is here, that all the service sector, all parts or the constituents of service sectors are increasing very rapidly, especially the financial infrastructure and the community services, as these were growing with the two-digit growth rates. Now, share of industries in real GVA at factor cause, as we can see that the primary and secondary sectors in 1951 constitutes uh, 53.5% and 14.7% share of real GVA. And here you can see that agriculture, allied or primary sector, is contributing most, and the scenario changes very rapidly in 2019-20 advanced estimates, that service sector now become the most important sector, constitutes about 53%, 53 to 54% share of GVA, while the agriculture sector is only constituting for 17.2%, and manufacturing has held itself to double its share from 1950 51 52 to 1919-20, and it is at 28.4%. Why service sector grew so fast in Indian economy? And this can be seen with these points. With the advent of information technology and the knowledge based economy, the role of service sector becomes very crucial. And because one part is financial infrastructure of service, so financial infrastructure in India grew very rapidly, and this can be seen in the growth rates table. uh, the next thing is public services grew rapidly in India, and because of the increased urbanization and increased per capita income and GDP, the demand for public goods increased very rapidly in India, and public services constitutes the sector service sector. So the overall service sector has grew very rapidly. The role of demonstration effect. What demonstration effects is? Demonstration effects are effects on the behavior of individuals caused by observation of the action of others and their consequences. So how we are going to copy the western pattern of living standard is telling you actually the demonstration effect. And this keeps the demand for non food items very high. That is why the service sector grew very rapidly in Indian economy. The next thing is growth in industry due to growth in services. Many industries in India are using this service sector or information technology or this artificial intelligence to increase the revenue or to increase the sales of their industry. So growth in industry is also helping to growth in services. The next thing and the most important thing is favorable international environment. Today the international environment we have is very beneficial to increase income or to increase export, to increase uh, export GDP ratio, to increase ties, to increase custom unions, to increase trade unions. And that is why this service sector is growing very rapidly with this favorable international environment. And the last but not the least, low labor costs in India, which is actually held grabbing jobs, uh, like outsourcing in India. And service sector, as you know, that information technology, India is very good in grabbing job in information technology sector. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with me. And in the next chapter, we'll be dealing with uh, resources, human or natural resources. Thank you so much.